Hello, everyone, and best wishes to all of you on the beginning of this fall semester. We're delighted that you've joined us today for this webinar and taken time from your very busy schedules to join us. This topic of diversity and inclusion, of course, is a very important one, not only for the classroom, but for organizations overall. And it's certainly a topic that is both timely and timeless. We certainly cover the topic in Harvard Business Review and on our website, hbr.org, for individual executives and leaders, through our corporate learning platforms, Harvard Managed Mentor and Spark. We provide learning paths for companies, managers, and employees on this topic. And of course, for all of you educators through webinars like this one today, as well as related course materials. But what's really important for me leading Harvard Business Publishing is our commitment to foster a culture of diversity, inclusion, and belonging for Harvard Business Publishing, also known as HBP. We really are trying to aim to create equal opportunity to thrive. And so it's probably not surprising that we've adopted a framework from two of our authors who have recently published a book. The authors are Frances Frye, professor at Harvard Business School, and her co-author, Ann Morris. The book is called Unleashed, the Unapologetic Leader's Guide to Empowering Everyone Around You. And there's a framework that they call an inclusion dial that we've adopted. And I think it actually has some parallels to our discussion today on building connection and inclusion in the classroom. This inclusion dial really has 4 points. The first is safe, and that really means employees feel physically and emotionally safe in the workplace, regardless of who they are. The second point is welcome. Employees feel welcome in the workplace, regardless of who they are. They can bring their whole selves to work without penalty. The third point is celebrated. Employees feel celebrated in the workplace because of who they are, and they are rewarded for contributing their unique ideas and perspectives. And the fourth point is cherished. A culture of inclusion permeates the organization. Leaders embrace differences among employees as a source of competitive advantage. And there's a minimal variability in the experience of belonging across individuals, teams, and functions. And so, as you think about this inclusion dial, I think it has applicability in the classroom as well. And so with that, again, a very warm welcome to all of you for joining us today. And so now I'm going to turn the dial over to Amy Bernstein to begin our webinar today. Thank you again.
Thanks so much, David. And welcome to all of you to our discussion today on diversity and inclusion, building connection and community in physical, online, and hybrid classrooms. I'm excited to be here today with Alexandra Sedlovskaya. Alexandra is the Assistant Director at the C. Roland Christensen Center for Teaching and Learning at Harvard Business School. She designs and executes research pertaining to management education and pedagogies that support participant-centered learning. Her research interests include case teaching, curricular innovations, gender and diversity, student evaluations of teaching, and teaching effectiveness. Alexandra will share her experience and her expertise in building a classroom community that supports and encourages difficult conversations about issues of diversity and inclusion. Before we begin, let me just touch on a couple of housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and a link will be emailed in the coming days to everyone who registered. And if you have questions, we hope you will feel free to ask them and just enter them in the Q&A window, not the chat window, if you would. So, Alexandra, so good to see you today.
Great to see you, and thank you, Amy. Thank you also, Sandy, for inviting me. Amy, did you want to say something?
Oh, I was ready to jump in. I'm very eager.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. So thank you, and thank you, Sandy, for inviting me and for organizing this webinar. And of course, thank you to all of you who are joining us today from very different locations. I can see that in the chat, very different time zones. And also, we also learned that from your responses. And I want to thank you for your responses. I'm very aware right now that I cannot see any of you. I know you're there, and I appreciate that. And being able to learn a little bit about you and your interests and issues that you're considering has been hugely important. So thank you.
So you mentioned that we already heard from our audience about their biggest concerns, which, you know, let me just tick off 3 of them that struck me. One is keeping students engaged. The second is making sure that all students feel heard and respected. And of course, a lot of people are worried about tech issues. So how should the people in our audience be thinking about these concerns as they prep for their first day of classes, Alexandra?
Great questions and great concerns. I certainly hope we can address many of them, certainly not all of them. And as I was reading through your thoughts, any one of those concerns could be a webinar of its own. And actually, reading through your responses is very similar to what I do actually in my course. So we talk about first day, but I want to step back a little and think about what I do even before that first day. And that's to reach out to my students and welcome them to our course. And I'm very explicit that this is our course and that I'm very interested to learn about their backgrounds, to learn why they're interested in this course, similarly to why you are interested in this webinar. What are their goals for our semester together? And then I also take my time to respond to each and one of them. And I know that this is time investment. It's a very significant time investment, but it's an important investment because this is what allows me to start building these connections with my students, getting to know them, and also making sure that they feel both that they are seen and heard as individuals, and also feeling like they are part of our learning community. Because when I respond, I also signal that I look forward to their contributions to our class. And that sets the stage for the first day of class, and that sets the stage for the entire term.
So our audience, many of them are about to start their first day. What should they be thinking about on that first day?
That first day of class. I have to tell you, ever since my early childhood, I was always so excited about that first day. And that excitement has not gone away. So when we arrive to this first day of class, I'm very transparent with my students. Transparency is the theme you'll sense throughout this webinar, and my students sense it throughout the course. And it doesn't matter how we arrive, whether we walk through the physical doors of our classroom, whether we join remotely the way you've done today, whether some of our students come in physically, others remotely. I take that moment to just stop and take that moment in, and I tell my students, let's take that moment. Let's look around. However that actually would mean in that classroom space, but let's take a look. You might know some of your classmates. Many of your classmates you don't know, or you don't know them well. I want us to remember that moment because the semester will go by and it really flies by, and we'll be at the end of our course and we will reflect back on this first day and we will think about how far we've come and what a community we've become. And then I tell them that as any community, well-functioning community, We need norms. Social groups have norms. And right there, I set up some of our norms that will allow us to become that strong community of learners. And I joke, to all of you who know me, that's because that's what I do. Not always funny, but doesn't let me stop me. I joke and I tell them that I'm going to introduce a framework. The framework that has words that have words that start with the same letter. And I introduce 4 C's framework. And the first C is curiosity. It's intellectual curiosity. And I draw on their emails, their introductory emails. And I tell them, I've seen all of you have that curiosity, and we're going to pursue it together. And the only way for us to be able to pursue that together, that's where the second C comes in. And that's candor. We need to talk about issues candidly, openly. We need to do that. And again, based on their introductory emails, I tell them that we have an amazing diversity. Similarly, I can tell you right now, based on your responses, we have an amazing diversity in this audience. And I want to make sure in my class that we get to hear the diverse perspectives, the diverse voices. And that's why it's important to be open about it. And that also means that we might have to voice opinions, which we never before had to voice because we were in the company of similar others, and that was the default. That also means that we might hear opinions that we've never heard before, that are drastically different from ours, or are in direct opposition to ours. And that's where the third C comes in. Courtesy, respect. We need to be able to voice our perspectives respectfully. We need to be able to respond and listen respectfully to the opinions of others. And I have to tell you, and I tell my students that a lot of times important conversations don't happen because of the fear that we have that we might come across as offensive, or we might offend someone. We're not gonna let it stop us because we're gonna always operate from that place of good intentions, that we have good intentions, and we are pursuing our intellectual curiosity candidly. And that brings us to the 4th C, and that's courage. And what do we mean by courage? Yes, certainly courage to voice openly our opinions, our perspectives. But it also takes courage, maybe even more courage, to be able to listen, really listen and understand the perspectives that are different from ours, that contradict our perspectives. And I tell them, listening and understanding isn't the same as agreeing, but this is how learning happens. Learning takes courage. And I'm very transparent, again, and I address some of the barriers right off the bat. I talk about judgment. I tell them that sometimes we might be afraid to say something because of the fear of being judged. And I tell them, I'm not gonna ask them not to judge. Judgment happens naturally, it happens effortlessly, it happens automatically. I mean, I'm looking at my clock. We've been on for what, 15 minutes? I'm sure you've made some judgments. You probably made some judgments about this webinar already. You might have made some judgments about me. And that's not a good or bad thing. It's what we do. So it's hard for me to ask not to do that. What I do ask my students is to think about how they're making the judgments. And that's a much more effortful task. How are we making our judgments? What is influencing our judgments? Because it can be very revealing and more revealing about us, of how we're making the judgments, than about the person about whom we're making the judgments. Our identities influence how we perceive and how we process information about others. My identities might be influencing right now how you're perceiving me, how I look, how I talk, what I say, perhaps my background. We just need to be aware of how, and that's what I'm asking my students, to be aware of how they're making their judgments. And I also tell them about this idea of pluralistic ignorance. It's a term, and I tell them that they're not required to memorize all of the terms, but it's important to know that there is a term, because that means that the phenomena is prevalent and important enough to have a term. And I tell them that simply what it means for us is that you might have a question, an opinion, and you might be concerned or afraid to voice it because you think you're the only one with this question, with this opinion. And you might be, and that's the beauty of diversity. You might be, and we want to hear from you. Or you might not be alone, but everybody else might be feeling the same way. And so nobody's saying that. And so this feeling that you're alone continues to grow. And I set that up right on the first day. And that really helps us throughout the semester when we talk about issues, when we talk on conversations, to come back and revisit those norms.
Mm-hmm. That sort of connects to the dial that David mentioned earlier, the safety piece of it. You know, a lot of the folks in our audience will be teaching all remote classrooms, and then others will be teaching in hybrid classrooms. How do the 4 C's change depending on the situation?
Yes, and I have to say, and maybe that's my optimism speaking, but I actually think that as we think more about online and hybrid, what it does, it also, I think, pushes us to think more intentionally and more purposefully about issues around inclusive community, issues around how we talk about very important topics that really matter. So in that sense, I'm actually want to celebrate that effortful thinking about it. And that's not to say that, of course, online and hybrid don't present unique challenges. I already alluded to some of that. Not being able to see all of our students' potential. I want to be sensitive that even in the fully online environment, different schools might have different policies of whether students need to have their cameras on or their videos on. And even in the best case scenario where all students have their videos on, there are tiles. There are tiles on our screens. And the bigger the class, the smaller the tiles. And some of our students might not even be immediately visible to us. They might be on the second or third page of our Zoom if that's what you're using. So how do we feel connected to our students, and how to make sure the students feel seen and connected to us? I mean, I talked about me, but surely you're aware that you're not being seen. How does it make you feel? How included do you feel right now? I'm not seeing you, but I know you're there, and I appreciate that, as I said. It's the same idea. But the good news, because I'm always the good news kind of person, just think about it. How many of us are here today? Thousands, right? Imagine if we were in a physical space. How far away would we be from each other? How far away would I be from you? But here, hopefully, you can see me. You can see my facial expressions. You can see the excitement that I have for being here, so much closer. And I can see Amy. I can't see you, but I can see Amy. I can see her reactions. And I emphasize that to students. And I'm very mindful of my own facial expressions. Yes, you don't see all of me, but you see that I'm leaning in, that I'm interested, that I'm excited. And I emphasize that with students. When I teach, I don't look at the teaching plans when the student is talking. I make sure that I make eye contact with students, whatever that means in that context. And of course, the student might not know, even if I'm looking at the camera. The student doesn't know that I'm looking at them, so I can even say explicitly, Amy, I'm looking at you right now because of what you mentioned in your post. And we'll talk more about some of the posts that can happen asynchronously and the value of asynchronous work. That's especially important in online and hybrid environments. And so this body language, making sure that people feel seen, commenting on their body language is critically important. And then hybrid, another layer, another dimension of diversity. And hybrid has many variations. What we'll talk about today, and certainly that's not all there is to it, I'll be happy to talk more about that outside of this hour. When we talk about in this webinar about hybrid, it's about students, some of whom are physically present and some of whom are joining remotely. And just as we're mindful in the physical classroom to include all students, I mean, let's be real, even in the physical classroom, we might think we see all students at once. We don't. We see students who are directly in front of us, and then we need to be mindful to kind of turn around, take other hands in. Are we calling proportionally on female students, on international students? And not just calling proportionately. Are we staying with them longer? Are we probing them equally? And that's very important. And now when you have hybrid, that's another dimension Are you including students who are joining remotely? Because it's natural to react. What's in front of us, the hand goes up in front of you, you're gonna react. And that's just another layer of being mindful. And right on the first day of class, I'm very purposeful for going toward my students who are joining us remotely and calling on them to signal right away. They're not passive observers, they're active participants. And that becomes hugely important throughout the course.
So before we go on, we're getting a bunch of questions from our audience. Just to kick off those 4 C's again, just remind us of what they are.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And this is exactly what I mean. Please ask questions. Similarly with my students, please ask questions and clarify. So the 4 C's. First C is curiosity. This intellectual curiosity. Second C is candor. This open pursuit of ideas. And courtesy is a third C, the respect with which we're doing it. And the final C is courage. Courage to both be able to openly pursue, listen, and learn. So those are the 4 C's. Thank you for clarifying.
And then another really smart question from the audience. You know, people love the idea of welcoming students before the first day of class. Well, what if they have big classes? What do they do then?
Can you repeat that a little bit? I missed the last part. Again, technological hiccups, they happen. You just asked to repeat, yes.
All the time. The idea of welcoming the students before the first day of class, that really hit people in a positive way. But what if they have really large classes? How do they handle that?
Yes, and again, I think what does even large class mean could also vary. We're talking about 100 students or hundreds of students. In a way, I think that actually if you have hundreds of students, this is where the irony is. It's obviously very time consuming, but that might actually be even more important because these are the big classes where students might feel especially not as individuals. So I think even if you might not respond to all students, just at least sending an email out, welcome them, and being very explicit that you're interested in getting to know each of them, that you're interested in hearing from them and learning about them, and bringing in their voices in different ways. We'll talk more about other ways you can bring in voices of students through this asynchronous work, but making sure that their students, that the students feel like their voices are being heard is really, really important.
Yeah. So I just want to bring in one more question before we press on with the questions that I had come up with. How, Alexandra, do you build community in a virtual world when, for example, a student can't come by for office hours or stay after class? How do you do that?
And thank you. And again, I just want to thank again for the questions. I just love how involved you are. And this is also very, very important. And this goes to our asynchronous work, meaning what happens outside of our class time together. And that is hugely, hugely important too, because, for example, in my course, I ask students to post reflections between classes and to post them to all of their classmates and engage with each other. And that builds community that we can't possibly build just within our short time together. And between the first class and the second class, students feel like they know each other more based on those posts. We also, throughout the semester, provide opportunities for them to come together in small groups. They're voluntary. And being aware of time differences when you're scheduling that. Holding individual office hours that take into account different time zones. Even when you welcome students, making sure you don't say good morning. It's not morning for many of you, right? But being sensitive to time zones and connecting outside of class is really important.
So what you say about creating inclusive learning communities and setting norms and expectations makes a tremendous amount of sense for courses in which, diversity, equity, and inclusion are core topics. But what about for courses that really aren't about those topics? What about finance or statistics? How does your thinking apply there?
I'm smiling because I love this question. It's a very important question. And my background in social psychology will be, I think, deeply reflected in my response. And I think any community, special learning community, and I'm saying learning community, which might go beyond academia, as David mentioned, really needs to be inclusive, to be learning community. And finance, research methods, I actually love teaching research methods and statistics. All of these courses absolutely require to have an inclusive learning community. And I think the same principles apply. What if you have a question and you're afraid to ask it because of how you're going to come across? Right. This is exactly this idea of being, pursuing with curiosity, not, kind of overcoming this fear of being judged and this idea of pluralistic ignorance that you're the only one with this question. We certainly know there are stereotypes around certain groups in certain fields, women in sciences. So making sure that everybody feels included in any course is critically important. Having said that, I also acknowledge that I have a course on self and identity. This is at the crux of what we discuss. The conversations we have are about issues related to our identity and around diversity. I understand that not all courses have that at their core of their learning objectives. But here again, bias perhaps, I'd say that finance, research methods, statistics, they don't operate in a vacuum. They're deeply grounded in social context, and they have important implications, important social implications. Research methods. How are we getting that representative sample? How are we collecting data to make sure that our sample is representative? Financial analysis. What are the assumptions that we're making? What implications are there of our analysis? Having said that, I do think that you might not necessarily have the whole class dedicated to the discussion around identity, around diversity, around inclusion. And that means that these conversations are likely to come up more organically, be maybe perhaps less planned, and some of them may be anticipated. I mean, you're all here, you clearly are all thinking about these issues. And so you might even frame from the beginning that you'll be talking about that. And there might be times when they will come up completely unexpectedly. And actually, let me tell you, that's the case for many cases, for many classes. In my class, issues come up unexpectedly. And in fact, that's why I love teaching this class so much, because they do come up unexpectedly. That's the beauty of diversity. You bring in different voices. I don't anticipate your perspectives. This is the beauty of learning. Of course, these issues might come up more unexpectedly and more organically in some classes than others. I think it's important to keep in mind as we talk about leading these conversations.
Yeah. So let's talk about how to lead these conversations, because, some people might feel a bit apprehensive about these conversations. They don't want to give offense. They worry about doing it unintentionally. What do you say to them?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the reason why sometimes those conversations don't happen isn't because we don't think they are important. In fact, they might not happen precisely because we think that they're very important and we don't want to get them wrong. And it's this fear of getting the conversation wrong, of the conversation going off track, of coming across in a way that we don't want to come across. It can all hold us back, which is, again, at first, I want to go back to the first day. Having those norms and exercising those norms already sets the stage. And then it's about the mental model. Is the mental model for us as instructors? Is the mental model for the students? How do we even think about having meaningful conversations? I tell my students, these conversations are not comfortable. In fact, I worry we're too comfortable. Like, are we all just talking about things we're agreeing? Why do we all come together? Why do we need this diversity of perspectives? We're all going to discuss issues on which we all agree. No, those conversations are uncomfortable. And guess what? They don't go smoothly. I know, like, what? Yes, I know you've invited me and you've introduced me. Like, I've been doing research on this. I've been leading those conversations. They don't go smoothly. I go back and I think about how I might have handled something better, how I might have said something differently. We all do. This is how we learn. The important part is that we don't let that stop us from having these conversations. And I think just having this mental model already, and we'll talk about more actually how we lead them, but even having that mental model and framing that for the students. Yes, the emotions might get high. We get emotional about issues that are deeply important to us, where our identities are implicated. We are invested. So yes, we might get emotional, but we will learn from those emotions. We will not shy away from them. And there are ways that you can actually step back and say, look, I just want to acknowledge we're getting very emotional here about this. Let's step back. Why? And I think that is a learning moment. This is how you know actually that you're having a meaningful conversation.
Mm-hmm. So how do you launch this conversation? Just give us an example of how to get it moving.
And this is actually another interesting idea, because as I said, some conversations might be framed and you'll frame it in front of the class, and you might be more prepared to have those conversations potentially, even though some moments can still come up unexpectedly. And then there are other moments, there's sparks that might be this amazing gift to spark a conversation. Sometimes we might miss it entirely, or sometimes we might see it, but because we might not have expected it, or we might not know what happens if we open up the conversation. It's this ability to both be able to see and take that spark as a gift. And so if a student, for example, says something, and especially we didn't expect it, and especially if it weren't central necessarily to our objective, we might kind of shut it down. But what I encourage you to do is follow the norms that I've outlined, right? Pursue it with curiosity. Stay with the student who has this idea. Learn about it. Tell us more. Tell us more what you're thinking. And then know that, you know, what does it mean to have conversation that goes off track after that? What does it even mean? I think it's important to know some of the exit strategies that allows us to be more relaxed about having those conversations. But stay with the students. It's like really this idea of trusting the student. Stay, understand. If you have time and you feel like you're well positioned now in this moment, open it up and have a discussion, knowing that you don't have to get it exactly right. But also know that you don't have to get exactly right in exactly that time. You can also acknowledge that this is an important issue that the student is raising, and that you want to make sure you spend enough time on it, enough time that really warrants, right, that conversation warrants. And you can decide that you will talk about it in the next class where you feel better positioned to do that. But I think what's important is we're deciding what is a tangent and what is not a tangent. That we don't jump to that conclusion too early. In fact, I say, unless your student fell asleep in the middle of the class and then woke up and decided randomly to share a thought, it's unlikely that it's a complete tangent. It's just that you and maybe the class might not yet see the connection, but the student somehow had made that connection. And so I actually asked the students, I acknowledge this is important, like tell us, help us connect it. What are you thinking? And maybe there are a few steps that the student had missed as they were building the logical chain. I think it's hugely developmental for the students, and it's a huge learning experience for the class.
Mm-hmm. What happens if you do give offense, if you say something that is interpreted as racist? What do you do?
Yes, and in fact, I tell that to my students. I use me as an example. I tell them that I've been doing research on this topic for over a decade, and I've been teaching and I've been researching issues around blind spots, implicit biases. It doesn't mean that I'm immune. I can say something that can signal my own, reveal my own blind spots. Other students might say something that reveals their blind spot, or also my blind spots, or even I might not pick it up. And in fact, I worry more about what I don't pick up than actually an offensive comment or potential offensive comment. And this is where I think asking students that if you do feel offended, please let us know. And I know this is a huge undertaking. I'm not asking you to go around now educating everybody why what they're saying has been offending. But this is a learning community. And great news, this is the classroom where we might have a very unique opportunity to take two, have a take three, have a take five at something. We don't always have that outside of this classroom. But here we can have multiple takes. You as an instructor have multiple takes. The students can have multiple takes. Maybe they haven't articulated something well, because we don't always necessarily have even preformed opinions. We might be formulating opinions. So please tell us. We'll learn from that. And we'll learn from our take three and take two and take 3 and 5 and 7. And also know that if something is potentially offensive and you're not sure, I think it's again important to operate from this place of trust and describing good intention. And sometimes you don't have to say anything. You also have the nonverbals. You can pause, right? Just like this. And the student knows something's off because you've paused. You can say something a little bit more, like, what do you mean? Right? And I think that in itself is signaling that you want to, you are ascribing good intentions. You want to understand. Because what you don't want to do, you do not want to come down hard on the students. Because not only you are punishing potentially the students, but you're also undermining the learning environment in the classroom. And others are watching and thinking, I do not want to step and be in that position. Or they might feel really badly for their classmates. So we also want to be mindful that this is a learning experience for all of us. And we want to make sure that we don't preclude those conversations from happening in the future.
Mm-hmm. So we got a really smart question from the audience on this topic. How do you respond when a student says something that is or could be perceived as, say, racist or sexist? What is the role of the instructor here?
Yes, and I think there are multiple ways you can respond. And what's important is you get this comment, and this comment comes immediately. You didn't have time to think about it. We naturally might have this fight or flight response. What do I mean by fight or flight? We can either react very strongly right away, or we can just pretend it didn't happen. And we want to make sure that we don't go into one of those directions, because if you pretend it didn't happen and you don't honor the comment at all, students might think that you either condoning it or you even missed it. On the other hand, as I already said, there are certainly some issues with actually coming down hard on the student. Mm-hmm. But again, what are the assumptions behind your judgment? And that certainly happened in my course when one of our students, an international student who was joining us remotely, asked the question, like, why are we still talking about racism? The United States had a Black president for 2 terms. Why are we still talking about racism? And you could hear this in the classes, like the air is being sucked out of the room. And you go, oh my God, right? In this initiative, is this a racist comment? But why? Why do we think this is a racist comment? Why? I mean, let's stay with that. What are you thinking? Like, tell me, where is the connection you're drawing? How are you thinking about racism? What are the implications to say that we had a Black president for 2 terms? How do we think about racism? And I have to tell you, opening up this discussion, staying with the student in this very much curiosity, respectful way, actually led us to have a very impactful discussion. And students who are initially had to actually articulate their positions, which they might not have otherwise had to articulate. And we've learned not only about different forms of racism, we've learned about racial stereotypicality too. There's been so much learning to the gain that at the end, I actually thank the student for opening up this discussion for us, for being able to learn. And the student also raised their hands, and this is really important too, that when somebody puts themselves out there and makes a comment, that I always make sure I look for their hand to go up again. Because one of the fears that we have is that we say something and we are misunderstood, and then we don't have a chance to correct or to change. And so when the student raised the hand again and asked, okay, may I change my mind? I think that's such a beautiful, courageous learning moment right there.
Mm-hmm. So it's not just you, the professor, the instructor, who can feel uncomfortable with sensitive topics. Students can. What do you do? Walk us through that situation, that as the instructor you perceive that a student or a group of students in your class is starting to get uncomfortable with the conversation.
Yes, and that happens. And like I said, it's not that I don't want that to happen. Get uncomfortable isn't the same thing as offended. There's a difference between being offended and speaking up about it and feeling uncomfortable. We are getting uncomfortable around those topics. And I think this is where the framing at the very beginning, or the framing of the conversation, becomes very important. And I can say, look, remember guys, I've told you that we will feel uncomfortable when we're talking about issues that matter. This is it. We are in the thick of it. Look, we're feeling uncomfortable. We're getting emotional. This means that we're talking about what matters, and we are talking about it. And I think that's something to celebrate as a class. And as we walk through it, as we discuss those meanings, as we work through our discomfort, this is almost like echoing my yoga teachers and instructors, like leading into the discomfort as a learning place. We come out stronger on the other side. And the next time, conversations emerge, we're stronger because we've made it through. We didn't fall apart. And that really binds us together. Is this really mutually reinforcing idea of absolutely needing to have a safe, as David mentioned, learning space. And having those conversations are critically important to then continue strengthening that learning atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. So we got a question from a member of our audience who says, conflict among learners across cultures is inevitable, and such an inevitability arises out of issues around language, nonverbal communication or gestures, learning differentials. How do you address this in line with the principles of diversity and inclusion?
Absolutely. And I think cultural differences, this is the beauty of the diversity. And I actually also want to say that, what do we even mean by cultural differences? When we think about cultural differences, how many of you right now thought different cultures, different countries? I have students from different parts of the United States. I have different students from the same part of the United States, different zip codes, doesn't matter. Culture, right, on a very different level manifests itself differently. And I acknowledge that, and I recognize that. And I think in the social norms are different. And we talk about in our class explicitly about, and it's not static. We can't think about culture as static or culture existing outside of individuals. Like I talk to them about that. Like organizations, you know, buildings don't do things. Like when we talk about bank does that, organization does that. No, people do things. And yes, we are influenced by our culture, but our culture is influenced by us. It's not something outside of us. And we explicitly talk about that and recognizing that there are different cultural aspects that we need to consider as we're having these conversations, which is why, again, being open-minded. The student might have articulated something, or their nonverbals, their verbals might be a function of their culture. They're not meant to be offensive. And this is where I think, again, being open-minded and pursuing with curiosity becomes critically important. So
this is another really interesting question. Oh, these are such good questions.
I'm telling you, this is the beauty of that. And an unfortunate side of only having an hour together, not even.
Yeah. So, you know, the technology and remote teaching is taking us inside students' homes. And we can see some pretty stark differences in the way people live. How do you deal with that as the leader in the classroom?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think in general, first of all, I'm just going to say that technology does take us into people's homes. I mean, welcome everyone. I mean, I would have never imagined before that I could have welcomed thousands of people into my own home. And I even tell students, because last semester we transitioned from my hybrid classroom into online space, and I welcomed those. I always wanted to have you over. I just never thought that would be the way. But I think it's, again, the way you frame it. We're recognizing there are differences. And in fact, my own research deals with concealable identities, identities that might not be immediately apparent. And now I think what this does potentially, I mean, I know we have virtual backgrounds too, but potentially it actually makes some of the identities less potentially concealable. But again, in my class, I want to make sure that we draw on all identities, that people feel safe if they want, not obligated, but feel safe to bring their identities. Our environment matters. We are joining from very different environments. We might have different identities that might be in contradiction. I mean, now that we've moved into the space, some of our identities, being employee, being parent, being caregiver, might have come into conflict more. And we need to understand how our identities influence our experiences. And this is just another element. And I think, again, being transparent, that these are different experiences, these are different identities. And I wouldn't force students necessarily not to use the background, but I think to the extent to which we can make our classroom safe where they feel revealing, this is part of them. David talks about that. And they talked about coming whole, but we can't expect them or force them to come whole, because some people might be more feeling like they can afford more to come and show up completely than others. And how do we create a space where they all can show up if they want to all show up as fully themselves?
Right. So how do you know that the conversation that you're leading on these topics is actually working, is doing what you want it to do? Do you have some kind of parameter? This is from a member of our audience. Do you have some kind of parameter that leads you to keep the conversation going or to cut it off? You know, what is the limit for you? How do you modulate between the safe and the brave spaces?
Again, Thank you so much for being so engaged and asking those questions. I cannot go back. I cannot wait to go back and read your questions. And I so hope that you will continue reaching out even after this hour and with your questions, with your thoughts. There's a lot to be learned from all of you. And yes, about these conversations, it's actually not even so much about what I have in mind. Like, I don't have this vision of how people need to respond and almost like a puppeteer pulling some strings to make sure that they talk in the same way. It's, again, approaching this with a genuine interest. And knowing at the same time that where we end up doesn't have to be in agreement on an issue. That's not my goal ever, to necessarily have everybody agree on an issue. It's about learning through the process. What are we discovering through this conversation? Perhaps maybe we're becoming more aware of the assumptions that are guiding us and the implications of these assumptions. What are the core issues? And what I do, I highlight the core issues. Maybe the core issues are our differences in opinions. How are we thinking about that? We don't all have to end up, as I said, in the same place. And also feeling like I'm supporting students without necessarily taking sides. Supporting students means listening to them, probing for essence, understanding and staying with them to understand what they are arguing, not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing. Having said that, you're right. There is a limit between being brave or being offensive and what are some of the boundaries? And one of the boundaries for me is we can discuss differences of opinions and differences of perspectives, but none of our identities are on trial. We are not having a conversation about the value of different identities. This is not about which identity is more or less moral, for example. This is not trying these different identities. This is about becoming aware of what we are thinking and what assumptions we're making about different identities and how they're influencing us.
Mm-hmm. Another question from the audience. How do you begin the conversation of inclusion with your team and your administrators when there are, curriculum expectations to be met?
And I want to make sure I understand the question before I answer it. And I know that's not coming from you, Amy, but as you say about how do you begin those conversations in the curriculum, I think perhaps the idea is what is central learning objective. I'm assuming that at the heart of this question is what if there is some disagreement around what is at the core of the central learning objective for this course.
Or how do you introduce this to make it part of the core?
Exactly. And I think hopefully maybe my framing could be helpful in the idea that regardless of what we're teaching, and you can actually talk about it this way, that we are teaching any topic that we're teaching it in a social context. We're not teaching a course. We're not teaching content. We're teaching students. Like at the end of the day, we're teaching students, not our content. And I think maybe that could be a good way to start a conversation, to say that we do want to make sure that students are learning and we are building an environment in which students can learn. And that's essential for any field. And to really enrich our understanding of any field, we need to hear those perspectives because we're not in a vacuum.
Yeah. Really interesting question also from our audience, of course. Your approach requires a certain level of vulnerability on the part of the instructor, and that might be interpreted by students differently based on the instructor's identity. So how do you deal with that?
This is so true. It's And when you say some vulnerability, absolutely. And in fact, students consistently comment in relations this idea about being vulnerable. And honestly, I expect students, right? We expect students when we have this conversation, we expect students to be vulnerable. Why shouldn't we be vulnerable? In fact, I tell my students, I never ask them of something that I'm not willing to do myself. And you're right. And even when I talk about transparency isn't the same thing as inner voice. Transparency, is when I said about kind of this acknowledging the elephant in the room. It's like, stupid, wish I didn't say that right now. But that's more of an inner voice rather than transparency. But I'm, again, being transparent with my students. On the first day, when I talk about our norms and standards in my teaching experience, I share the story. For example, that when I was first going to the classroom, being not very different in age from my students, so being junior, being female, being international, right? And I got an advice from an amazing, amazing professor. I got this advice that I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but like, don't be yourself. But in like, which part of myself do you not want me to be? I have many aspects. But I think what's important there is this idea that some of us do need potential more credentialing. And I tell that to my students, like, I've been advised explicitly to mention to my students that I was a valedictorian, that I was a National Science Foundation recipient, right? You know, that I graduated from Yale. And I joke with them, I say, just kind of, but I had to do it in the way that also wouldn't appear to be self-promotional, because women also get backlash if they start self-promoting. So I need to mention that, but I need to mention it in a way that doesn't seem like I'm self-promoting, kind of like the way I've mentioned it to you now. And we be explicit about that. And I acknowledge that how they experience that matters a lot. As I told you from the very beginning of the webinar, how I look, how I talk, what I say influences your judgments. And I tell it to our students.
So along the same lines, another question from the audience: how does a non-white faculty member help students of color have a sense of belonging in a classroom where they are in the minority?
Exactly, because I think sometimes, right, just the numbers alone, we know if we're in the minority and we have multiple different aspects to our identities, and when we are in the minority, for that identity, especially if it's important, becomes salient to us. It becomes salient, and that's really important. And of course, there are numbers that make certain identities salient for us. And this is exactly why I think it's incredibly important to celebrate that diversity. But at the same time, we need to be very careful that if, for example, so I'm from Russia, Russian, you don't want to be like, hey, Alexandra, so what do Russian people feel about that? You want to make sure that you include my perspective, but not that I become a token, right? So you want to make sure that you acknowledge that I might have different experiences having come from Russia, that I might have different experiences that shape my perception. At the same time, that you don't always go to me for the perspective of Russian people or from the perspective of women. And sometimes even when I'm present, and even though I do research around gender and I'm the only woman, it's not always entirely clear to me whether I'm asked something as a woman or as a researcher who does research on this topic. And I think it's critically important that students don't feel like it's the latter. I'm sorry, like the former, where you actually just simply ask because speak for all the women. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Another interesting question: how do you get buy-in to discuss these sensitive issues from your class? How do you get your students, to want to be part of what can be very discomforting conversations?
And this, I think, is a very important question. And I think you can argue that, yes, perhaps students who take my course on self and identity might have already kind of voluntarily signed up for those conversations. Some of you might be thinking that. What happens if they signed up for finance? They don't want to necessarily, right, talk about issues around identity, and they might or might not. But I also have to tell you that even in my own course, some issues come up that students don't necessarily feel like they signed up to talk about that. And I'm actually going to argue that it's precisely the moments when students don't necessarily want to talk about those moments. Those are the moments that especially need to be discussed. And I'm explicit with my students. I've thought about that. Do we as a class want to spend our precious little time together to discuss this issue? And I know some of you might feel right now, no. But I've decided it's really important that we talk about that. And let's see how you think about that. And in fact, I think that's even more important for students to hear when they might feel like otherwise they would not have this opportunity if they don't voluntarily come to this webinar to have this conversation, but to be respectful about that. And I hear from students openly through their feedback, like, oh, we've had this conversation. I thought, wow, when it started, like, what a waste of time. And then I realized, oh, how actually mind-opening it is that I thought that was a waste of time. What I've heard from other classmates, it's very central to them. And recognizing that to some of us, something might be central and we need to be aware. Because what's central to us might be central to others, and that's why it's so important to have those conversations.
So, we're getting toward the top of the hour. This has gone by so quickly. I've seen another couple of questions about your 4 C's. I think we had some sound dropout when you went through them again, and they're so important. Would you just take us through once more?
Yes, absolutely, and thank you. Yes, so the 4 C's is amazing. If you walk away from this webinar, remember the 4 C's
yes.
of community, the fifth C. And again, these are just I just want to emphasize, these aren't set in stone. You can adopt them. You can use them differently. You can play with them around what makes sense to you. But the 4 C's, curiosity, the intellectual curiosity. And you have that too now. I mean, look at the questions you're posing. They're incredible questions. So curiosity, candor. I'm answering them very openly, right? I've seen also in chat, like, what do you mean don't be yourself? Don't worry. I could not have followed that advice, but yeah, but I'm candid with you. So candidly, respectfully, right? A third C is courtesy. So it's curiosity, candor, courtesy, respectful. And courage. Courage to learn, courage to offer perspective, courage to listen to the perspectives. These are the 4 C's.
So curiosity, candor, courtesy, and courage. Those are our 4 C's. Those are.
And feel free to write me later, or maybe you have other variations, and they don't have to start with the same letter. It's just something that works for me.
And very memorable and really useful. Thank you so much for sharing these thoughts with us today, Alexandra. And thank you so much to the audience for those fabulous questions. And before we close, I'd like to hand this back to Sandy.
Great. And let me just also very briefly just thank the audience. And similar to what I said, that the conversations don't end when the class ends. I hope that this conversation doesn't end when our webinar ends. So please reach out with more questions, with more thoughts. I would absolutely welcome your outreach.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Amy and David and Alexandra, and really everyone for joining us today. We hope that you found today's presentation helpful. We have a few more things we want to discuss. You'll see some links listed on this slide, and I just want to take a moment to go over them, and they help to provide some additional resources. So first of all, if you don't have an educator account, we encourage you to register for a Harvard Business Publishing education educator account. It's free, and with this you will get access to teaching notes. You get access to our full catalog of cases and simulations. So again, encourage you to really look at that, and we encourage you to join. I apologize, I was running into something here. So anyway, the second link listed is a link to a resources page that we've created. We curated resources that are helpful in teaching online and in hybrid classes. And on that page, you can also check out the latest edition, which is our new Teaching with Cases online guide. So in closing, our next webinar will discuss amplifying engagement and energizing students in large online classrooms. Teachers and students often complain that online classes are wearisome, they're even trying sometimes, and we know that suboptimal engagement undermines skill development, human connection, and joy of education. In this webinar, Professor Ted Ladd will provide specific techniques for teachers to increase student engagement in large online classrooms for both undergraduate and postgraduate courses. Ted teaches at Holt International Business School and Harvard University. That webinar will take place on Thursday, September 17th. The link to register for the webinar, along with the link to register for an educator account, which again, I encourage you to do. It is free and it's very easy to do, and you will have access to so much information on our website. And so that link is also in chat, as well as the link to additional resources on our resource page. We have posted them in chat so that you will have some time to explore them. We're going to leave chat open for a few minutes so you can take time with those links as well. So again, thank you for spending the time with us today. And please do connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn as well. So thank you, and be well.